The recent PvP Strike Team update in the TWID has left me pretty disappointed. Enough so that I'm breaking another YouTube hiatus to upload my thoughts and opinions on such. I feel the conclusions they've drawn feel like they're often missing a perspective or more holistic view, with what feels like maybe an underlying motive of focus on usage rates or data, or reacting to some loud vocal feedback. This is as opposed to a clear design vision faithful to the fantasy and identity of each individual sandbox item. This long analysis, although critical and driven by my personal experiences, is meant constructively and respectfully, and as always, it's just my opinion. I'd like to start by talking about the long-range engagements or metagame, including 340 pulses and similar outliers. Their initial comment is when they look at the high skill primary weapon for the last month, accompanied by a good usage graph of effectiveness here. We can see that Rose, Elsie's Rifle, Graviton Lance, and Bygones have distanced themselves from the rest of the pack. Bygones, they acknowledge, is egregiously out of band, and they say that's thanks almost entirely to the high ground perk, which I would agree with, which they are taking a first swing at, but honestly it's a swing and a miss. They mentioned that they're going to be keeping an eye on other top performers, but the current thought, and this is a standout phrase or statement to me, is that most of these weapons are very close to the upper end of what they want primary weapons to be able to do in their current roles, and they're more invested in bringing other options up than hammering those options down by more than small amounts. They mentioned that the meta has moved away from closer range engagements, and they believe the consolidation around those specific weapons is due in large part to a combination of two main things: the difficulty of engaging in medium to close range combat windows with the current level of ability uptime stemming largely from Prismatic, and two, the lack of competition for their medium long range primary options outside of pulse rifles. So I think while abilities certainly contribute to a trend of players avoiding the close mid-range, I find it hard to believe that this is a sole prominent factor leading to the usage of 340 RPM high impact pulses and their other similar outliers. But first, let's examine why players are gravitating towards the high impact pulses and the similar outliers, as this in my opinion is and has been the largest contributing factor. 340 pulses have been among the strongest weapons for actual years now, and they've only gained stronger additions to the archetype, Red Death and Elsie's joining No Time to Explain and Messenger, and players are gravitating towards the benefits of both massive damage per shot and a really fast TTK potential. They have high damage per burst, which means you can put high pressure for low time on target and low time out of cover, and it's also great for maximizing team shot lethality. They have high range, of course, to take advantage of high damage from minimal risk and safe positions, while being able to heavily disrupt players in transition from closing the gap. And lastly, of course, their fast 0.67 TTK ensures that there are no compromises, maintaining an incredibly high personal ceiling. Of course, the main downside of the archetype is the slowness of the actual weapon, as well as the slowness of the rate of fire. It can feel a bit sluggish for some, and it is more punishing towards missing complete shots. I think though that we've realized that the player skill has accounted for this and worked around it with things like Knucklehead Radar, showing a high representation in the metagame alongside these, and of course players have gotten good enough that they can pretty consistently 2-burst, and if not at least take advantage of the benefits of these weapons. Another overlooked or omitted factor in this argument they've presented is the state of special weapons and how they dissuade closer mid-range play. Special weapons as of recently have gained a great deal of power with new perks like Lone Wolf and Closing Time, and we have two craftable options, the Shotgun and the Fusion from Garden, with said new perks are both now accessible and considerably stronger. Not to mention with the 111 ammo crate system, it ensures that there is an abundance of ammo generally in play. And while maps might influence weapon choices, these same outliers are consistent even on the closer range map, like currently Jav 4, which debunks a bit of a specific need to play range entirely and more so emphasizes the strength of these outliers. I think that over time, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, through metas including bows, 340 pulses, and 120 hand cannons, player skill has developed and gradually realized the value of high DPS weapons. And with the continued drop in population for PvP and the average skill rising, tight peak shooting becomes a standard behavior in the Crucible, so landing less shots for more pressure and benefit is not only easier, but necessary. Them having made mention that these outliers are close to the upper end of what they want primaries to do, and this to me is concerning and has quite a few implications. Of course, they added more outliers to join the 340 pulses by buffing 2 bursts, buffing high grounds, and putting it on bygones, and both these outliers perpetuate the same problems I previously mentioned, in some cases even worse. The 2 burst buff felt out of left field, kind of, and like it was justified through either biased favor or usage rates and data, given that I feel they previously did their job fine and fairly, and Graviton of course leads the representation of this archetype. And High Ground is inherently poorly designed with little elevation difference needed to activate, with also seemingly getting a buff out of nowhere for what feels like similar reasons. Of course, High Ground has the highest impact on the adaptive pulses like Bygones, and that has such an insane impact on that archetype, shifting the TTK to a 0.6, maintaining essentially all the benefits that the 340s would offer, with even more forgiving rate of fire, and that's why players are choosing it. And I feel that rather than acknowledging the potency and strength of these outliers and how they're problematic, instead it feels they've attempted to shift the blame to abilities, backed with a claim that now this is the new bar for powerful primary weapons. And again, that thought to me is pretty concerning. The trend of high impact weapon metas necessitates network volatile tight peak shooting and actively discourages players from being naturally curious and investigating engagements as the radar would suggest for them. The possibility of peeking a lane and losing either 70% of your health or instantly dropping dead actively discourages aggressive play due to a slim margin of error and resulting in players holding angles to ensure advantage and minimizing risk, which perpetuates the cycle. High impact weapons, especially those that have a fast TTK, serve to tank the pace of play and slow the game down for these reasons. High impact weapons in their current state suck the air out of the room and take away from more fair weapons residing in the 0.9 to 1.2 second TTK. This means weapons like the 140 RPM hand cannons, 450 RPM pulses, 200 RPM scouts as some of the best examples, but of course not limited to these. Each of these weapons require landing shots at a quicker cadence for, in my opinion, skill expression in duels because there's less time to refocus shots, but enough time to be punishing for misses. They have like that perfect kind of medium. And they don't deal immense amounts of damage per shot while having a fair time to kill that offers more room to react, gain info, and partake in a fight without having to disengage after a single shot's fired. I think that identifying with the high impact weapons in their current state as okay insinuates that we're going to continue to see this hug the wall style gameplay and less of a return to mid-range play with fair dueling weapons. And I don't agree that the solution is bringing other weapons up and would rather them acknowledge that the weapons or perks are problematic and some changes were unnecessary. They mentioned they believe that there's a lack of competition outside of pulse rifles as a whole, and I couldn't disagree with this more. Any lack of competition is being created by the weapons themselves being overpowered as outliers. And other weapons already exist to contest them in said space, but they have difficulty doing so because most of them have reasonable trade-offs, whether that be in the form of time to kill or less versatility. Things like 120 hand cannons or scouts having a worse TTK, and 150 scouts generally having less versatility. Pulse rifles, like I said, mentioned as an entire archetype for mid-long range, when the majority of these sub-archetypes still struggle to compete with those very outliers themselves. A bit of a side tangent that burns just a little bit more for me in my personal enjoyment or bias is that Luna's Howl and Magnificent Howl were changed in a way that entirely scraps their identity. While they were low DPS, 180 hand cannon, lower range options that shared the same or now slower than Bygone's TTK even in their prime. The inconsistency, the lack of direction in their changes is aggravating. On the note of the 120 hand cannon buff, I feel this buff is pretty unnecessary given that these weapons would still have plenty benefit over 140s because of the inherent benefits being a high DPS weapon, even if they were to stay at 3 crits. But of course, PI exists for better or for worse to commit to more leniency through the use of a perk. Now, allowing 120s to 2-tap through damage perks again further contributes to the overall problem, and I feel like this is a lesson we've already learned, and I think these perks will probably replace Precision Instrument on most people's rolls. 120 hand cannons are versatile and powerful for the reasons of other high impact weapons, but they come with the cost of a pretty fair 1 second TTK, forcing players to effectively play cover and team shoot to mitigate the lack of dueling potential by really flexing the opportunity and benefits of the high impact weapons. And I think this is healthier design of high impact weapons, and as such, a buff not necessary in my opinion. If 120s absolutely needed to 2-add-1 body to separate them, given Rose's performance in the sandbox currently, why wasn't the body damage tweaked alone, now that, to my understanding, the whole checkmate mods were applied to the base game, to allow them to get a 2-add-1 body without enabling kill perk 2 taps? On the topic of the changes to high ground, they mentioned taking an initial swing at it, when really that swing, as far as I am aware currently, if I'm understanding correctly, is meaningless. The strike team did acknowledge the problematic nature of high ground and PvP well, gotta give the credit where it's due, but they pushed a change that doesn't really accurately reflect that. The nerfs and buffs only happen every so often, as we all know, so they've gone in and actively changed the perk, but not enough to actually make a meaningful difference on the main problematic outlier that they fully acknowledged. It's not, as far as I understand currently, going to stop the bygones from 2 bursting. So this feels like either some sort of favor or bias, or the idea that they believe that this is okay, or of course both, and for me either are concerning. I think high ground's already plenty powerful, but given an unnecessary buff that shifted it from being a niche situational perk that offered strong benefit to lacking necessary opportunity cost for a damage boost. They mentioned requiring more elevation difference is part of a potential solution, and in that way the perk's already problematic. And while I empathize it wanting to be a strong option in PvE, this is a portion in the TWID making mention as part of the PvP strike team, and while I'm happy that it's a good option in PvE now, it's now terrorizing PvP. Now let's talk about Prismatic and the attention on abilities. I think while the cooldown change is fine in theory, and as mentioned, a temporary solution, it unfortunately continues a trend to me of just a bit of bias and poor changes in my opinion. The segment on weapons throws abilities or Prismatic under the bus, mostly failing to acknowledge its own problems and contributions, and Prismatic's claim to have a higher ability uptime, but all the abilities are pre-existing and don't share a different cooldown as far as I understand, so I'm not really connecting the dots there personally. The strike team's language also, while addressing abilities, appears to carry some sort of weight against them, clearly defining as combinatories or combinations as problematic and having concerning dominance. Abilities, don't get me wrong, they are in no way innocent and they do warrant changes. But said changes need to examine the potency of both the individual ability as well as treat the combinations on Prismatic as their own subclass or fantasy, and of course balance them accordingly. I think the recent ability changes have largely been amiss in my opinion, often hurting the identity of an individual ability and its home subclass while failing to properly address major pain points. And it feels like changes and the magnitude of their changes appear to be made or justified based on graphs or data, or just addressing and adhering to loud vocal feedback that agrees with such. My current expectation for changes is that they're made to things in the game that properly assesses the fantasy or identity of the content, considers perspectives, both enjoyment and pain points, identifies the purpose in the sandbox of said item, prioritizes intuitiveness and game feel, and ideally addresses these things with minimal loss. I think another major factor in the sentiment towards abilities and Prismatic right now is that stacking duplicate abilities has always been a pain point and problem for years now. It's been continuously perpetuated and unfun. This needs a solution of some sort, as they've been exploring recently, which is great, and I think it adds to the perception of power or prominence in the sandbox of a given thing and begins a chain reaction. Or ability cooldowns unfortunately need to start considering a team-wide economy of some sort. The individual cooldown change, I think while fine, appears to lack true impact, which makes me feel that this change is more so to dissuade players from playing Prismatic to satisfy usage rates rather than addressing core issues. But in all fairness, they did mention that more systematic changes are to come and they're exploring that. I think that Knockout and Diamond Lance are both abilities not tied to cooldowns as an example of where this change won't have an impact or will sway in their direction. And I've mentioned this in the past, but so long as Gambler's Dodge exists, hunters will be able to ignore a stat category and spam abilities in combat. And that explosive kind of moment of spamming abilities will happen in close range and mid-combat. Specific changes to Storm's Edge that allow more evasiveness I think are good, although other changes, maybe the DR, but definitely the cooldown reduction to a tier 1 super are pretty heavy-handed and will likely render the super too weak or unusable in more organized play like in Trials. To end things off, honestly now more than ever, I can't help but feel that the Strike Team's PvP is going through a complete identity crisis. Since the rapid injection of checkmate into the wider game, there's been little to no direction behind implementations, rapidly pivoting and walking back changes, or worse, implementing systems seemingly out of nowhere, and continuing to convince or justify them with data. Thinking about special crates here. And omitting perspectives or factors where convenient. It feels as though data is used to validate the magnitude of changes rather than tell stories, and loud sentiment is used for further validation. There feels as though at times data or feedback is cherry-picked to best represent an argument rather than be considered, and recently has me second-guessing my own in-game experiences. It feels as though there's a bit of lack of understanding in player trends or meta developments that should be used in tandem with data, including players' own perception of ability, weapon, or strength, or influence from a highly influential figure or high-skill player. This is my general sentiment towards the last year at least, and continues with the Strike Team update. I'm honestly surprised at this point that the enormous decline of PvP population doesn't signal a lack of success of the Strike Team or sandbox changes among players, but that is, in fairness, likely in part due to a wider combination of factors. Everything said is by no means definitive. This is just my opinion and experience or perspective from the last little while, and is just another opinion in the sea of opinions and perspectives that are all valid in their own ways. I'm putting mine out here just to give some feedback and hopefully represents a voice to if you feel maybe similarly. Anyways, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Take care.